Okay. Good morning, everyone. I think we're about to be live. Are we live? We're live. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics for what is International Economics Week here in Washington and at Peterson. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's my privilege to be serving as a host and occasionally, along with colleagues, moderator of a series of high-level events this week, looking at the world economy as a whole, the system, the stresses it's under due to geopolitics and corrosion of globalization, but the successes and the advances of economic integration that remain. And there is no more important topic under that heading than the renewal of the global trading system. And it's our privilege today to have the Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, to have a conversation on the record. The occasion for this conversation, we are very proud at the Peterson Institute to host it, is the start of the recognition that it is now 30 years since the Marrakesh Agreement was signed, which turned the GATT into the WTO. Despite what some people in Washington say and some people here, this was a good thing. This was a very good thing. It was a necessary and useful step to managing the globalization that exists and to addressing the needs of the countries, the member countries of the world who are not the United States, China, and the European Union, as well as being in the long-term self-interest of the three large economic blocs. And as the WTO experiences and celebrates, but most of all, takes stock and looks forward to the next 10 years, the next 20 years, the next 30 years, we want to support and encourage a constructive, positive discussion about the role the WTO plays, its interactions with the major economies as well as all member economies, and its substantial, tangible benefits for the world economic system. I'm sorry to be putting it in such crude, blunt terms, but sometimes the Washington discussion seems to miss this. So please allow me to introduce our guest, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She took office as Director General of the WTO on the 1st of March 3 years ago in 2021. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has been a leader in discussions and, more importantly, policymaking around global public goods, global principles, and the world economy for decades. She was previously chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. She was appointed as the African Union Special Envoy to mobilize international support, financial support for the fight against COVID, and WHO Special Envoy for access to COVID-19 tools. She's a skilled negotiator in international fora, has brokered numerous agreements, including those during her tenure as Director General of the WTO. She twice served as Nigeria's finance minister, separated by nearly a decade, 2003 to 2006 and 2011 to 2015, and briefly acted as foreign minister in 2006, the first woman to hold such positions in Nigeria. She was 25 years at the World Bank as a development economist and rising to the #2 position at the bank as managing director of operations. I just want to say that there is a very short list of individuals who combine genuine economic insight, genuine global public spiritedness, the personality and the skills to interact successfully on the global stage, and the basic decency to be motivated by doing the right thing. I believe Ngozi, who I've admired for a long time, is one of that very short list. So with that, let me invite the Director General to the stage. We'll both latch on our mics, I guess, and have a conversation. This is entirely on the record. and we will then go to questions from the in-person audience here with us today. Thank you. Welcome, Madam Director General.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming here on this occasion. Let us, there goes the mic, so now we can get into it. Let us start to hear from the horse's mouth, as it were. Living in Washington, it's easy to forget a lot of things. One of the things that tends to get forgotten is the underlying importance of the WTO's role. It gets taken for granted or overlooked. Can you talk us through what you see as the WTO's role and the work it actually does, rather than the image some people have, perhaps?
Well, thank you, Adam. First, let me thank you and the Peterson Institute for hosting us on this, the 30th anniversary celebration of the WTO, but the 80th for GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And I cannot say that the Peterson Institute doesn't take account of the WTO, because we've done some wonderful research here. So thank you, but what does the WTO do? People should not forget it, because it is the one institution or organization that is central to keeping world trade open, free, predictable, and fair, and stable. And people may not be aware, but 75% of world trade is carried out on WTO terms. And people hear a lot about regional free trade agreements between bilaterals and regional. But even those are based on the platform of WTO rules. And you'd be surprised to see only about 20-something% of world trade goes on under those agreements. So WTO is a remarkable place in which governments have come together and agreed to certain rules to bind themselves to tariffs that they keep steady and available to all WTO members, saying that they will not charge above a certain set of tariffs. I'm going to speak in very layman's terms. They will allow goods to come in at a certain set of tariffs that they've agreed with the WTO that is available to all its members. They will abide by certain rules of trade that make sure that there's transparency and predictability, without which businesses would not be able to invest and export and import. If you don't know what is going to be charged for your goods when they get to a country, that makes for a very unpredictable way of doing business. So the WTO is the guardian of all of that. The second thing is that there are certain agreements at the WTO that also make sure that trade is safe and that certain standards are observed. I know people don't notice, but products have different standards. When you buy a particular product, it's made in a certain way and reaches a certain standard. And the WTO has an agreement, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, that looks at product standards, make sure they're interoperable, and that those standards are not used as a means to keep goods out from one country to the other. They are not used as a barrier to trade. We also look after health and human safety. We have the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures Agreement, which also makes sure that members can assure that goods coming into their countries respect a certain quality and are safe for use and consumption. So these are the basic things that keep trade and life going, and the WTO has a responsibility. Just two more quick ones. Intellectual property. Mm-hmm. We are also the home of the Trade-Related Intellectual Properties Agreement. It's called TRIPS, and I'm sure many people heard about it during the pandemic. And that is the agreement that makes sure that if you innovate. Research and innovation, your intellectual property, if you have a patent, is safeguarded, and people cannot just use it the way they like. However, during critical periods like when we had the pandemic, we also have the ability to relax some of the rules guarding this, allow flexibility so that countries, for instance, could override this and be able to manufacture some of the vaccines that were so scarce. But this is something that is not regular. We're able to do that, but normally the agreement safeguards intellectual property. The trade facilitation agreement reduces costs for trade, and that's one that we're very proud of. So I could go on and on, but the WTO also monitors how all these agreements are being respected and makes sure that members keep to the promises they've made. We are also the home of dispute settlement. If any member has...
Well, let's get back to dispute settlement.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so we have committees working constantly that are looking over all these agreements and making sure that they do function and that members do stick to what they promised. And, there's constant review. So there's a lot of work that goes on at the WTO that people are not aware of.
And that shows up in everyday lives of households, consumers, small business around the world.
Yeah.
Another aspect, and you rightly mentioned that this is the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions, of which the WTO is one. And one of the aspects of the Bretton Woods institutions is that they're very inclusive. They have, in your case, over 100 members, many different economies, many different income levels and size. What do non-US members of the WTO feel they get out of membership, out of what the WTO delivers for trade and for their people? I mean, it's what you spoke of is generally true, but for the developing countries, the lower middle income economies, the smaller economies, how do they see what the WTO does?
Well, I think that non-US and US, I'll come back to US.
Yeah, we'll come back to US.
Yeah, but non-US members attach a lot of value to the WTO, I have to say. We have 164 members. Two just joined, so we'll be 166. And we have 22 countries waiting in the queue to join. And the process of joining is so arduous, it takes years. So if they didn't see value, I don't think countries will work so hard to reform their economies and negotiate access agreements with other countries so they could join. So that's the one thing. But what do they see? Obviously, joining a community where you are able to trade on predictable terms. We've all seen, countries have seen that the trade-enabled growth has been able to lift people out of poverty. Over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty through trade-enabled growth. So countries want access to that. They want to be able to export their goods in a predictable and fair and open fashion. So they want to join the WTO. They want market access to other countries' economies, and they know that they can negotiate this with the various members when they join the WTO. So you had Jay,
Shemba.
Yeah, recently here, where he talked about the issue of debts and financial stress of countries. And many of the developing countries, they have to export in order to be able to earn the foreign exchange to pay off debt. But I think even more important is to earn the money to lift up their populations, to build infrastructure, and to help reduce poverty in their countries. So they see a lot of benefit out of that. But even middle powers have strong support for the WTO because they depend on trade. Singapore's trade to GDP ratio is 336%. This is a country that we all respect, and it depends so completely on trade. Germany, a rich country, 100% GDP, trade to GDP ratio. And I could go on and on. I think Korea is 70%. So even middle powers are quite dependent on trade, and they see the value to that. So these are some of the reasons that non-US members, now trade to GDP ratio of the US is 27%, China 38%. These are huge economies, but all the same, these are not trivial numbers.
No. And so let's now turn to the US. And it does seem that dispute settlement aspects of the WTO have taken on a very large significance, I would say an outsized significance, both in Congress and in Trump and Biden administrations. There's been this huge focus on dispute settlement. So what is the state of the dispute settlement mechanism? How is it working? How does the US sort of pulling back and out affect it? And is it as important as people make it out to be?
Well, thank you, Adam, for posing that, because it will give me a chance maybe to clarify one or two things about the dispute. I think the issue of the dispute settlement system of the WTO has gotten such outsized attention and importance, and I think I can understand why, but it's almost obscured all the other wonderful work that goes on at the WTO. So the WTO is about much more than the dispute settlement system. That being said, it's the only system or place in the world where members can bring each other when they have trade disputes. And maybe that is why it's taken in such importance. Of course, the US had complaints about the way the system was functioning. It's a two-tier system, the panel and the appellate body, and they thought that there was judicial overreach of the appellate body, and it was taking too long to come to its judgments, and there was too much of a court kind of approach to settling trade disputes. And so, well, if you look at some of the US criticism, other members also have criticisms. They feel the system is costly, not so accessible to smaller members. So the US is not the only one. There's some validity to that. So the appellate body was blocked. Judges were not allowed to be elected. And that is why everyone now feels that, oh, if that's not functioning, then the system doesn't function. But I just want to let everyone know that the system is actually functioning. There are several aspects of it. I said it's a two-tier system. The panel level is functioning, and I brought some numbers to share with you on the number of disputes that are currently going on. But more importantly, I want to share with you that the fact that the appellate body was not functioning has led to some creativity and more use of the other aspects of the dispute settlement mechanism that was foreseen. It was also foreseen that there would be use of mediation, arbitration, dialogue, good offices of even the Director General to try and settle disputes. And I think what may have upset some members, including the US, is that it became a litigation. Mm-hmm. Every dispute was litigated without much of an attempt to use the other aspects of the DSU to try and settle. So, but it is working, and I thought I'd bring some numbers because I care about this so much. As we speak, I just want people to know that since MC12, 18 months now, there are 11 new disputes have been brought to the dispute settlement mechanism. As we speak, 6 active, out of this, there are 6 active panels that have been constituted, which they come to me to help constitute. They are going on, meaning cases are being looked at. There are also ongoing consultations. That's the first level. If you have a problem, you ask for a consultation, one member to the other. And then if things don't work, you can move on to other aspects, including the pure dispute settlement mechanism. So these things, 12 disputes have been settled also since the past 18, 19 months. And these disputes have been settled in interesting ways. Members have resorted to mediation, to dialogue, to trying to settle things between each other. And I think that's using those aspects of the DSU that were not being used before. So we're quite happy about it, that this kind of creativity has come in. You would have heard of the Australia-China disputes on barley and on sold wine and so many other things that were before the dispute settled. They've been settled now through this creative way of dialoguing and looking for mediation. I won't give you the details of what went behind that,
no.
but it would, and so on. And you have India, US, that has been settled also outside of the system. And some members have begun to adopt panel reports before they would almost automatically appeal them. So I'm just saying that the system is alive, it's working. It is true that sometimes when a dispute, a panel report comes in, the member can appeal it into the void because the appellate body is not working. So I'm not trying to say that that is not a problem. There are 31 appeals into the void right now. But I'm saying that the creativity we are seeing is quite unprecedented. We also have the multi-party interim arrangement, which was another approach set up by the EU and some other members to act as a second tier, and that's also being used. So dispute settlement at the WTO is alive and well. That being said, members do want to reform the entire system, maybe codify some of these approaches we are using now much more so that they can be used more in future, but also look at the second tier and say, what should that consist of? Should the appellate body still be there? 99% of members would like that, but if it is there, how should it function? And how should it be shaped? These are the reforms which we are embarked on now.
It is great to hear about the kind of institutional creativity that goes on, and I want to acknowledge my Peterson Institute colleague, Cecilia Malmstrom, who, when she was Commissioner for Trade at the EU, was one of the leaders in setting up some of these alternatives. And as you said, Madam Director General, it's about dispute settlement. It's not about dispute litigation.
Exactly. I mean, Cecilia is well known and acknowledged for that.
So let me take you to the other end of your many-fold brief. You mentioned MC12. You came out recently from the Ministerial Conference 13. You're a veteran of so many international conferences and negotiations. What was the most significant achievement, and what in your mind was the most disappointing setback in Abu Dhabi at MC13?
Well, first of all, I want to remind people of the great success of MC12, which was only barely 19 months ago.
Yes.
Most people did not expect anything out of MC12, and we were able to pull off more than 6 multilateral agreements and a number of ministerial declarations and decisions. So that was really a success. I'm saying it because people forget quickly. Then we come on to MC13. I think the circumstances, MC12 took place after the pandemic. People had not seen each other for a while, and so on and so forth. But the world was a little bit calmer. MC13 was taking place against many headwinds. Great uncertainty in the world, conflict in very important places, a high inflationary environment. There's so many things that are not so right.
Not conducive.
Not conducive. And on top of that, we had more than 60 elections, some of them in very key countries. And you know that what I'm finding out as DG WTO, after having a career at the World Bank, is that it's so different because trade is part of the domestic politics of every country. So it is much tougher to deal with. And so when you have a huge number of elections, that also has a bearing on the way that members will approach their negotiations. So against all these headwinds, we went to MC13. And what were the successes? Here again, I want to say something that I noticed. The successes we had were things that developing countries have been looking for quite some time. But because it's for developing countries, I hardly heard anything talked about it in the press. It was dismissed as not important, trivial. And I resent that. You know, we shouldn't do that. It was funny, I went on a tour after MC13 to the Gulf countries and to some other developing countries, and they were overwhelmingly feeling that, oh, this worked well, we didn't get everything, but this was good. Why? Because 28 least developed countries for almost 10 years have been trying to negotiate an agreement to give them a transition period after they graduate from the least developed country category to still enjoy the special benefits at the WTO, under WTO rules that least developed countries enjoy, because they are not sure whether they are going to fall back into that category or, continue to be developing countries. So they've been asking for this. And after 10 years, we made a breakthrough. And this was agreed. Members came together and agreed to give them a transition period. So when you're talking to the 28 least developed countries, they feel they got something rather good. There was another breakthrough. Developing countries at the WTO as a whole have also been asking for a review of some of the agreements to see if what we call special and differential treatment, that is, those particular flexibilities from implementing the disciplines of the agreements that developing countries enjoy, if they could have them reviewed so they could work for them much more effectively. Again, this has been going on for 20 years, no breakthrough. For the first time, we had an agreement at MC13 that this could be reviewed, starting with 2 agreements, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and the SPS agreement. So developing countries are feeling like we got something out of this MC, but it hardly got any notice or mention in the press. We also extended the moratorium on not charging customs duties on electronic, that is digitally delivered or driven trade, which is huge for business. We got it extended for 2 years more, and that was also, it was very dramatic at the end. We almost didn't get it. Indonesia almost closed it down at the end, and we got that. So those were 3 clear wins. Now, I was very disappointed personally, and I think almost all the members, that we didn't close on the second phase of the fisheries subsidies agreement. We are negotiating this global commons agreement to stop harmful subsidies going to, fisheries, to fish in our oceans. And we want to safeguard our oceans and our fisheries. We did the first part, which stops harmful subsidies to illegal, unregulated fishing of our high seas. The second part is overfishing. And overcapacity, and we were so close, but we didn't close it. But I'm not too depressed about it because we're really close, and I think we are going to do it. But that to me was a disappointment. Agriculture. Food security is a big problem for everyone in the world today, and the price of food, prices are high in almost every country. They've come down since the peak of the pandemic, but they're still higher than before the pandemic. So it's a big problem. And we still did not get a breakthrough in agricultural trade negotiations. This is now 2.5 decades. We have not been able, and that is seriously important. So those were, I would say, 2 areas. I do want to mention one other nice thing that happened. A plurilateral agreement on investment facilitation for development was concluded by 125 countries. And I'll come back later to why I think it's very important, because we need to clear the cost of investing in developing countries, and this was concluded. So you've seen the sides, 2 big agreements, multilateral, that one of which we are so, I can smell it, we are so close to concluding, and we didn't make it. So we'll have to do it now.
I'm conscious of the time. This is all terrific to have you explaining this and setting out with your passion so close that you can smell the fisheries. But you mentioned food security. That word security is taking on a much bigger role in discussions around trade than it has for some time. National security, food security, supply chain security, security of supplies. And we have a lot of unilateral actions by various countries, including the US, on national security grounds or on wanting to assure some resilience in supply chains. We you were deeply involved. We all went through COVID-19, where in the expression of air travel, everyone wanted to put on their mask before helping others. How do you see this burgeoning of security claims? Again, some of it seems legitimate, is understandable, but is there a race to the bottom here or an escalation race? Is industrial policy reconcilable with the WTO? I mean, this is obviously a huge issue, but how do you think about it?
That's a trick question, Adam.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's a straight question.
I mean, look, one of the things we have to grapple with as we reform our dispute settlement system is the national security exception. Of course, and this is not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, countries and members know best what their national security situation is, and the WTO cannot pretend to really be able to tell you. However, it is how that national security exception, how and when it is called in, that is the issue, and what measures are being talked about. And we just have to be careful that we don't use this national security exception in such a way that any member can do the same. And it could become a race to the bottom. Everything can be made into a national security exception. We need to be very careful that it doesn't come to that. And that is why, as we try to reform the dispute settlement, we must look at this issue carefully and see when, how, when is it appropriate, not appropriate. So there's an issue there. It's in contention at the WTO. We haven't solved it, but we have to grapple with it. On the industrial subsidies, this is another, I mean, you know, when we were in graduate school, industrial policy, let me say, was not a good word. But all that has changed now, and we have the new industrial policy. We have sometimes subsidies being used. We've actually, it's not so new. We've had old industrial policy where some countries have also been using subsidies. It's always been a contention of the US and other, Europe and others, that China uses industrial subsidies in its, you know, to support its manufacturing base. China contends that the US is very heavy on agricultural subsidies. So we have a subsidies issue at the WTO. But coming back to that, I think, I mean, some are using industrial subsidies now in the context of trying to deal with decarbonization and trying to get to net zero by 2050. And at the WTO, we're very supportive of decarbonization and so on. I think it's the way that the subsidies are used that we have to be very careful, that they are not discriminatory, and that they do not require local content, because those are things that the WTO rules are clear about. We also worry that the spillover effects of this on other countries or other members could be quite impactful. A subsidy race to the bottom will not serve members. Ultimately, sometimes if you look at the history of this kind of subsidies, the literature, it backfires sometimes. So we have to be very careful. And then developing countries, the poorer ones, or even some emerging markets, their fiscal situation is not such that they can afford to engage in this race. So in a way, we are telling them, well, you can't engage, so those who have the money, they will be the kings and queens. So all this means these are issues we have to be very mindful of.
That last point is one I personally have seen as very serious, and I'm glad to hear you having that on your agenda. You mentioned decarbonization. One of the biggest measures, at least intended towards decarbonization, is the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism and trying to line that up with their carbon pricing. There's obviously a lot, I shouldn't say obviously, there are a lot of voices from developing countries, from lower income countries, that CBAM and the European approach is actually unfair I'm not asking you to adjudicate that, but how do you see climate clubs, environmental standards playing out at the WTO? What role can the WTO play to enable us to move forward on decarbonization?
Well, let me say one thing. Personally, myself, and I believe strongly in the impact of climate change and the need to decarbonize, but so do we at the WTO. And I don't think there's anything in our rules that stops countries. We actually encourage to try to decarbonize and move towards net zero by 2050. And it's not just a developed country problem, not at all. There are many developed countries who also have issues,
right,
or who have raised questions about the CBAM, about deforestation. Similarly, the EU and China have raised questions about the US's IRA. So it's not a divide, it's actually a mix. That being said, one of the things we find at the WTO, where we like to have standards that are harmonized and interoperable, is that the approach to decarbonization and carbon pricing is very fragmented in the world. We, quote that there are more than 78 or so different carbon pricing systems and approaches in the world. The World Bank totaled up the numbers some time ago. And so businesses have to face all these multiple, they are the ones that trade.
right.
Mostly governments don't trade, it's businesses. And so the issue is, how do we get some harmonized approach that can make things easier all around? We can still decarbonize, but we have interoperable systems. The US just released a paper last week, also calling for a look at this approach and how we can be, we can see more interoperability between the different approaches. And I think it's a good thing for members to look at. So what we, at the WTO, you asked what can we do and what are we trying to do about it. First, we've provided a forum for members to talk to each other about these differences. There are committees, we have committees that deal with these issues, Committee on Trade and Environment. Members have been able to start exchanging on these issues. And there's nothing like being able to talk to each other, put your cards on the table. So that's one. But we've also used our convening power to bring, let's say, the EU to the WTO, the person who crafted, the DG who crafted the CBAM.
Right.
We invited him, he spent half a day at the WTO engaging members, both developing and developed, and they got a lot of feedback about this. Those who are very concerned, South Africa, Turkey, for
right.
instance, some emerging markets were quite vocal. We also brought the DG responsible for deforestation, because that's another one that really bothers many members about the rules regarding you cannot sell in the EU if the products have come from deforesting. Right. And so countries like Indonesia and many African countries also are very concerned, and Latin America. So we provided a forum for this exchange, and it was a really good one. They were able to get feedback. So that's something the WTO can do, begin to get an understanding. But beyond that, we also have noticed that, look, we found out that other international organizations are working on a global carbon pricing approach. We were doing that at the WTO, and Dr. Bright, my chief of staff, and the chief economist, I don't know if he's here today, they are co-leading a task force. Right. We noticed all of us are working on it, and last October in Marrakesh, I suggested to the finance ministers, why are we all working in parallel? Why don't we bring everybody under one task force and try to come up with an approach and methodology? This was accepted, so we now have the IMF, the World Bank, UNCTAD, the WTO, and OECD, and UNFCCC has to join. So this task force is now made up of this, and hopefully we'll come up with a sensible approach that can answer the question, how can we be interoperable? Not everybody is going to charge a carbon price. The US will not do that. But their approach can be calibrated if we come up with a common framework. And so this is what we are trying to add to the
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask one last question of the Director General, and then we're going to turn it to our in-person audience. Ngozi, can I ask you, in a sense, now to wrap up, your vision statement? So we're at 30 years, 80 years from the gap. We hope you'll serve forever, but anyway.
Good luck, Adam.
Yeah, I was about to say, you may not hope that. But 10, 15, 20 years down the road, where do you want the WTO? What's your vision for the world trading system as we approach a next major anniversary?
Well, you know, Adam, there's so many exciting things happening that the world trading system, I want us to be involved in. You know, and that's why it's important we also deal with some of the legacy issues like the agricultural negotiations, finished fish, and so on. Because look, let me just take a few things one by one. Climate change, we just finished talking about. My vision for the WTO is an organization that is helping to solve the global commons issues of the day. And that's what we should be doing. So on climate change, how are we going to contribute to make sure that we don't have all the trade frictions that could come from approaches that are disparate to, let's say, carbon pricing?
Right.
We are doing it. We're trying to to develop this common approach. But this is important for the future. How does trade enable decarbonization beyond the carbon pricing? There are so many things. We developed a toolkit, actually, for COP28. I'm sad we didn't bring a copy. Do we have a copy? I want to show people. I'm very proud of it because we sat down and said, in what ways can trade contribute to climate change, to managing the warming of our planet?
Right.
We should be looking at issues like that, and we've started. So that green trade, 1.7 trillion. Now, I think that's a wave of the future. Without trade, you cannot decarbonize because you can't even diffuse the technologies that are needed at scale from one place to the other and reduce the cost. So for me, this is very exciting. This is an existential threat, and trade has a role to play. You look at the issue of digital, services trade. You know, we focus a lot on goods, but services trade is very important and is a growing part of trade. And digitally delivered services trade, which is very exciting, is growing at 9% per year. It's the fastest growing segment of trade. And you know, anything from, you know, accounting services to education online to trade, you know, entertainment. This is trade. Many people don't realize it's over $4 trillion worth of trade growing at 9%. How are we prepared for that? Do we have rules that govern this? So I'm quite excited that we have a plurilateral agreement that is being negotiated to lay down e-commerce agreement to lay down the basic rules of trade. And 90 of our members are doing that. So being involved in digital trade and looking at e-commerce, being involved in green trade, these are helping. And then we have a big problem in the world of increasing inequality. Before the pandemic, incomes were converging between developing and developed countries. Now we see since the pandemic that there's more divergence now. So inequality between countries is becoming a bigger thing than it was in the past. What can we do about it? We have said that we need to encourage, if we are going to build resilience in the world because of the vulnerability of supply chains we saw during the pandemic, let's build resilience in a way that also brings in those who were at the margins of globalization before and use that to solve the two problems of resilience and inequality. Why don't we decentralize and diversify supply chains to these countries? We're calling it re-globalization, a reimagined globalization, and WTO is at the forefront of trying to see that vision, and it's already happening. What's happening in Vietnam, it's moving to Bangladesh, to Morocco, to Romania, Bulgaria. Even Rwanda is getting a look in, DRC with critical mineral supply chains. This is exciting. So this is another thing we can contribute to. So these are just some parts and areas of trade that the WTO should be looking at. And I see us in the future looking at digital, the use of AI, and how that really can enable trade and you know, make costs lower, for instance, in supply chains. There's so many exciting things. So my vision is of a vibrant WTO that is really helping to solve the critical problems of the day.
Terrific, thank you. Let us now turn to our in-person audience. As with the Director General's remarks, everything is on the record. There is a standing mic midway on the right, my right side. There's also should be somewhere, a traveling mic that's going to come to the front. If you wish to ask a question, please wait to be recognized and then identify yourself when you do. Yeah, if you want to go to that mic, is that possible?
Ueda Douche with the University of Maryland. Hi, Ngozi. I'm going to ask you an easy question. Candidate Trump is promising to institute a 10% tariff across the board if he's elected. I'm not asking you to comment on the US election, but what would be the implications of that for the WTO?
Well, thank you for not asking me to call. I can't control US elections.
No one can, that's
No one
the problem.
can. We keep our fingers crossed. But look, I mean, I think it was a 10% tariff on everyone and 60% on China. If this is done, obviously, it does not, it's not helpful to the WTO or its rules. I think it will result most likely in a tit-for-tat approach. Other members will also look to levy these kinds of charges in return. That's what I think. And then I think we'll have a little bit of a free-for-all, which would upend the stability and predictability of trade that I just talked about in the beginning. So I hope sincerely that that will not happen. And that if something happens, that other members will keep a cool head and not retaliate, so we can preserve the world trading system. That's what I would pray, that, okay, they'll keep a cool head and we'll try to negotiate with the leader who has imposed this and try to get them to see that this is not helpful. So mediation talk first, but if that doesn't work, if we upend a system, everyone will lose. I mean, it's a lose-lose situation. There is no win in that. And I hope that will become obvious so it doesn't happen.
Just to piggyback on that, here at the Peterson Institute, we have an ongoing multi-author effort led by Warwick McKibben, Marcus Nolan, Megan Hogan, trying to take seriously and literally the trade, migration, and foreign direct investment restriction proposals of both the Biden administration and the Trump campaign. And I not surprisingly, largely agree with the Director General. This is lose-lose. But we will be publishing in coming months estimates of how much, in what time frame, the losses would be in some ways.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for doing that, because coming out from you will give it the kind of clauri that, I mean, if it's coming out from Peterson and others. We've done work. Any attempt to fragment the world trading system with this kind of behavior, we've shown that fragmentation results in big losses globally. 5% GDP loss if we fragment into 2 trading blocks, because this might happen. If you take that approach, we might fragment trade. And this is not at all good. And double-digit losses for developing countries.
Exactly.
And poor countries. So they would be the biggest losers from this. So I sincerely hope that it will not come to that and we'll be able to find a way out.
We will be having a similar conversation, I believe at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. today with Geeta Gopinath, the first deputy managing director of the IMF, and she and her team similarly, I'm just making sure I have the time right, similarly are doing work and coming up with these kinds of numbers on the costs of fragmentation and the incidence being much worse for the developing countries.
I mean, it's really very comforting. 2 years ago, we did the first work on fragmentation, and I presented it at the IMFC, the fund meeting, and everybody was intrigued. But what I'm excited about is, having done this work, the IMF did it and validated our findings. Yep. We found a 5% real GDP loss in the longer term from fragmentation into 2 trading blocks. They found 7%. And they've also found double digits. So it's very comforting when another organization does the same work and comes up with the same results. So people can really see that this is very not beneficial to the world, this kind of fragmentation.
We could go on. Sorry, the lady there.
Uri, nice to see you, by the way.
Hi, and thanks for being here, Madam Director General. My name's Martha Muir. I'm a reporter at the Financial Times. I was just wondering if you could go into any more depth on what form reform to the national security exemption could take and how the WTO might go about bringing kind of head-butting powers like the US and China together to agree on something like that.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What form the national security exception could take?
A reform to the national security exemption might take and how the WTO might go about bringing together powers like China or the US, for whom that's obviously super important.
That's the $1 million question. Look, I think this is something, I'm not trying to escape your question, but sincerely, what form it takes has to be negotiated by members. It is not something that I can predict. Members have to agree. We already have something, but obviously it's not working well in the view of some members, so they have to come together to agree. When should it be used? What form should it take? That has to be a negotiated thing at the WTO, not a diktat. I could give you my opinion, but that's my opinion. It's not what members, and it's a member-driven organization. So that's the first. And I think in that discussion, obviously the US and China and every member, not just the two, will have to agree on this because any member can use the national security exception once it's agreed. And that's why we have to be extremely careful how it is calibrated and how members agree to use it, so it doesn't result in undermining of the rules of the disciplines of the organization.
Thank you. I believe right there. Thank you.
Annabelle, you cannot ask questions.
I will ask insider questions.
She was doing all the subsidies work at the WTO before she decamped to the Inter-American Development Bank.
Thank you very much, and great conversation. Thank you, and thank you, Adam, for organizing. You referred to digital trade. So I have a question in this area because there is a sense sometimes that digital trade only benefits advanced economies, and in particular only benefits 5 or 6 companies. Can you speak a little bit about this dimension of digital trade and how can the WTO help developing countries benefit from digital trade?
Well, that's actually a very important question. The reason we're so gung-ho on it is because we are finding that digital trade is benefiting developing countries and small and medium enterprises and women are very much engaged in this type of trade. That's what makes it exciting and why we believe that it could also help us with issues of inequality. So even though the bulk of digital trade takes place in developed countries now, but it is fast growing in developing countries. Countries like the Philippines, India, and I could name several others are really doing well. In Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. So Africa is still 0.9% of digital trade, but it's coming up, it's fast growing. So the idea that it doesn't benefit developing countries is not true. It will. We do have an issue for developing countries, and that's the so-called digital divide. Many of them are not well connected. They don't have the physical infrastructure. You can see that where there is, young people and women are fully making use of this. And I can tell you country after country how I meet with SMEs, and they're all doing it, you know. But then how do we deal with this issue of the digital divide? We actually have to act. What we have done, and this is dealing with the supply side issues, we decided to team up with the World Bank. You know, many countries, developing countries would not join the e-commerce negotiations because they say, why am I going there to agree when I don't even have much of the basics? So we have to break that divide. The World Bank and ourselves, and Mona Haddad is right there. She's our partner. We are piloting in Africa an approach to help bridge this divide by investing in both hard and soft infrastructure. We've started with studies first to gauge what we're dealing with and what are the gaps. Some countries like Kenya already have master plans for how they do it, so you only have to come in to support or look and see what gaps. So we're piloting 9 countries, and if we can do this successfully, actually today, or is it tomorrow, I'll be meeting with the 2 vice presidents of the Africa region, and later with Mona and her team, to make sure we're moving this along. So that's the part that we can do. Try to help on the supply side, including using ITC, the International Trade Center, an offshoot of the WTO, to deal with some of these issues, whilst also making sure that we give technical assistance to countries who want to know how to trade, how to reach markets, and so on. Yeah, so quite exciting.
Quite exciting. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it off there to stay on time.
Is it already 1 hour?
If you'd like to come, if you didn't have another job, I'd happily have you as a visiting fellow, and we could talk all day. In all seriousness, Madam Director General, it is a great part of your public service that you are able to be and choose to be so public-facing and clear in the benefits that trade brings to the world and the benefits that the WTO brings to the world via trade. So it is the 30th anniversary of the creation of the WTO from the GATT. It is the 80th anniversary of the GATT and the other Bretton Woods economic institutions. And this is going to be a year of celebration through progress. And so I'd like you to join me in thanking the Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, for showing us her leadership and her vision today. Thank you.
Thank you.